All right, so rabies. We're going deep on this one. You sent over a ton of stuff, articles, FAQs, even a YouTube video about the rabies vaccine. Seems like you really want to get into it.
You got it. Yeah. Rabies is well, it's a pretty fascinating disease when you think about it. I mean, it's been around forever. People have been dealing with this for
Oh, for
centuries.
sure. It's like 2300 BC, right? That's what one of the sources said. Crazy.
Yeah, it's a long time. Definitely not something you want to mess with, though. So, what exactly is rabies? Well, it's a virus, attacks the central nervous system, and the thing is, once you start showing symptoms, it's almost always fatal, both for animals and people.
Yeah, that's scary stuff. And it can spread in a few different ways, right? It's not always from a bite.
Right, you're thinking of, well, bites are the most common way, for sure. That's when saliva from an infected animal, like, gets into a wound, but it can also get in through cuts, even mucous membranes.
So, like your eyes, nose, mouth, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, like, even if you get saliva in a cut and you know the animal was infected, could be bad news. Better to be safe than sorry. And the main animals that spread it can be different depending on where you are, like, different parts of the world.
Yeah, one of the sources mentioned that dogs are the main culprits in Southeast Asia, but in North America, it's more likely to be wild animals, right?
Exactly. Raccoons, foxes, skunks, bats, those are the ones you got to watch out for here. Monkeys and rats, those cases are pretty rare. But, wild rodents in certain areas, you got to be careful.
Makes sense. So let's talk symptoms. You said earlier that once symptoms show up, it's usually too late. But what should we even be looking for? Like, how does rabies actually affect cats and dogs?
Well, there are two forms it can take, furious and paralytic. The sources you sent mentioned both.
Wait, so there are two different types of rabies?
Yeah, kind of. The furious form is what most people think of, like uh, hyperactivity, getting aggressive, disoriented.
Yeah.
Sometimes they might even, like, attack objects.
Wow, that's intense. And the paralytic form.
That one's, well, less obvious, but just as dangerous. It causes progressive muscle paralysis, so difficulty swallowing, their jaw might hang open, yeah, and eventually paralysis in their limbs.
And there are those early signs too, right? Like things that might not seem like a big deal at first. The sources mentioned fearfulness, aggression, biting for no reason.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's so important to pay attention to any changes in your pet's behavior, especially if they've been outside. Like even if they're eating weird stuff or, their bark changes, anything out of the ordinary could be a sign something's wrong.
So what should we do if we see any of those signs?
First thing, call your vet, like immediately. They'll be able to figure out what's going on and, you know, tell you what to do.
Okay, good to know. So we talked about animals, but what about humans? What are the symptoms of rabies in people?
Well, it's pretty similar to what you see in animals, unfortunately.
So the same two forms.
Yeah. But the early symptoms can be a little vague. Like you might have a fever, headache, just feel kind of blah, lose your appetite, throw up.
Huh.
Sometimes you might even feel pain or itching or even a tingling sensation where you were bitten.
That sounds pretty general, like it could be a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why it's hard to catch early. But as it progresses, things get a lot more serious.
And that's when you see those more classic rabies symptoms.
Right. That's when you might see hydrophobia, fear of water, sensitivity to light and noise, agitation. You might get disoriented, have trouble swallowing, which, some people mistake that for foaming at the mouth. And then eventually paralysis and, well, death.
This is all pretty scary stuff. One thing that stood out in the sources was that there's no treatment once you start showing symptoms.
Sadly, that's true. It really shows how important prevention is. And, catching it early.
Absolutely. And speaking of catching it early, if you do get bitten, the sources were really clear about what to do. Wash the wound right away, like really well with soap and water for 10 to 15 minutes. Then clean it with alcohol or povidone iodine. And of course, get to a doctor immediately.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that medical attention is important because they'll probably give you something called post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP.
Right, PEP. And that's a combination of rabies immunoglobulin and a bunch of vaccines, right? And
Right.
I know there's also pre-exposure prophylaxis for people in high-risk jobs like veterinarians.
That's all correct. But for most people, the best thing is to just be aware, be careful around wild animals, and most importantly, make sure your pets are vaccinated.
Vaccination is so key. It protects them and us.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling there's a lot more to uncover here, especially with some of the things I read in these sources. Like some of the details were pretty fascinating.
Oh, there definitely is. We've just scratched the surface. We haven't even talked about how the incubation period can vary so much.
Yeah.
Or that cats are actually more likely to get rabies than dogs in the U.S.
Hmm.
And there's some new treatments that are pretty exciting too.
Okay, now that's what I'm talking about. Let's dive into that after a quick cat.
So are you ready for some of those intriguing details about rabies?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Hit me with those aha moments.
Okay, so let's talk about the incubation period.
Yeah.
That's, the time between when you're exposed to the virus and when you actually start showing symptoms. You might think it's pretty straightforward, but it turns out it can be all over the place.
Really? So it's not like a set amount of time?
Nope. It
Yeah.
depends on a bunch of things, like what kind of animal you were bitten by, how bad the bite was,
Yeah.
even where on your body you were bitten, and the animal's own immune system plays a role too. But yeah, like in cats, for example, it can be anywhere from 10 days to, get this, a year or even more.
A year? That's crazy. I had no idea it could take that long.
Yeah. So like you can see how it's tough to know for sure if an animal's been infected or not.
For sure. Makes things complicated. And this kind of ties into another thing that surprised me. One of the sources said that cats are actually more likely to get rabies than dogs in the U.S.
Yeah, it seems kind of weird, right? Because
Yeah.
you always hear about, beware of dog bites and all that. But when you think about it, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Cats, they roam around a lot more, so they're more likely to run into, you know, those wild animals that carry rabies, like the raccoons and foxes and bats we talked about.
Oh, right, because those are the main carriers in North America. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So this next one really blew my mind. Apparently, there are only like 7 recorded cases of people surviving rabies.
7. It's crazy, right? Yeah, it shows you how serious this is. And I think most of those cases, those people had either been vaccinated before, like the pre-exposure thing, or there was something really unique about their situation.
So vaccination is really the best way to protect yourself. And speaking of vaccination, one of the sources talked about this intradermal or ID vaccination method. What's that all about?
Oh, yeah. The ID method is pretty cool. It's basically like they use a smaller dose of the vaccine and they inject it into your skin instead of your muscle. And get this, it works just as well as the regular shot, but it's way cheaper.
Wow, that's huge, especially for places that don't have a lot of resources. I mean, if you can make the vaccine more affordable, that could really help a lot of people.
Totally. It's like a perfect example of how science can actually make a real difference in people's lives. And there's more good news. Like they've come up with these new rabies immunoglobulins that don't have as many side effects.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so those older immunoglobulins, they could be pretty rough on people, like a lot of side effects. But these new ones, they're purified or something, so they're a lot easier to handle.
That's great news. Fewer side effects and a faster recovery. That's a win-win.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's pretty encouraging. Even though rabies has been around for so long, we're still making progress, still figuring out new ways to prevent it and treat it.
Definitely. So let's bring this back to our listener for a sec. What does all this mean for them, like in their everyday life?
The main thing to remember is that rabies is serious business. It can kill you, but it's also preventable. So, the more you know about it, the better you can protect yourself and the people you care about. Make sure your pets are vaccinated, stay away from wild animals, and if you do get bitten, go to the doctor right away. Don't wait.
All great advice. Now, before we wrap up, there's this one big question that kept coming up in the sources you sent, and it's well, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
You're talking about a cure for rabies.
Exactly, because like we've been talking about, once you start showing symptoms, it's pretty much game over.
Yeah, that's the tough reality. But here's the thing. There are scientists all over the world who are working on this. Like, they're trying to come up with new vaccines, new treatments, and even a cure.
So there's hope.
There is. It might not happen tomorrow, but the research is looking promising. And that's why it's so important to stay informed. Keep up with the latest news about rabies research.
It makes you realize that even though rabies has been around for like thousands of years, we're not giving up on finding a solution.
Exactly. So, we talked about those 7 survivors earlier. They beat the odds. And who knows, maybe with all this research, maybe one day rabies will be a thing of the past.
That's a great point. We can't lose hope. We've learned so much about preventing rabies and treating it. And with all the research that's going on, there's definitely reason to be optimistic.
Totally. It all comes back to that. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about rabies, the better we can protect ourselves, our families, our communities, everyone.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, rabies has been around for centuries, and we're still learning new things about it and making progress, too.
Yeah, I know, right? That's what's so cool about science, I guess. There's always something new to discover.
Definitely. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, any final thoughts for our listener?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, rabies isn't just a problem here in North America. It's
Yeah.
a global issue. The sources you sent, they talked about how rabies is a huge problem in a lot of developing countries where, they don't always have access to vaccines or treatment.
That's a really good point. It's easy to forget that this is happening in other parts of the world too, not just here.
Right. And it just shows you how important it is to support those global health organizations that are working on rabies prevention. Educating people about rabies, making sure people have access to vaccines, encouraging responsible pet ownership. Those kinds of things can make a big difference.
Absolutely. So for our listener, the person who's been with us on this deep dive, what's the one thing you want them to take away from all of this?
I'd say remember that rabies is a serious threat, but it's not unbeatable. We know how to prevent it. We know how to treat it. And there's a lot of research going on that's really promising. So, if we all do our part, stay informed, take precautions, and support the research, we can actually make a difference. Maybe one day, rabies won't be a problem anymore.
That's a great message to end on. Hope for the future. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. I learned a ton, and I'm sure our listener did too.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. And hey, remember, stay curious, stay safe, and stay informed. You never know what breakthroughs are just around the corner.
That's right. And on that note, we'll wrap things up here. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.